الحمد للمتوحد بجلاله المتفرد وصلاته دوما على خير الأنام محمد.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to Khairabadi Institute's first ever podcast. We're very happy to be launching this today, and one of the reasons why we're trying to do this and putting this together is so that people can get to know more about the Khairabadi tradition and the Farangi Mahall tradition in particular, and this entire late Mughal intellectual tradition that has existed. And we're very fortunate to have my dear friend, my brother Ustadh Shams Tameez here today. Ustadh Shams Tameez is someone who has a takhassus, and he has looked quite deeply into the Khairabadi tradition, the Farangi Mahall tradition, is actually completing a PhD on that tradition as we speak. And so, alhamdulillah, I'd like to welcome him today because what we want to kick off with in today's session is particularly al-Kalam, which is his field of interest and his field of takhassus, and more particularly Imam Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī and his very famous Aqā'id al Aḍudīyyah. So inshallah, I want to get straight into it. Just as a disclaimer here, I want to make a point that this is a one, inshallah, of many podcasts where we will be looking at particular issues of interest with regards to the Khairabadi tradition, which branched from the Farangi Mahallis in particular. And this entire Farangi Mahalli tradition is rooted in the Maturidi and the Ash'ari tradition, actually having a sanad muttasil all the way back to Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari rahimahullah ta'ala himself. We are very fortunate to be recipients of that tradition. Mullah Shams himself has a sanad muttasil in that tradition, and so we're very fortunate that we are putting this together, and we hope that you guys, inshallah azawajal, will be able to learn a fantastic amount of things from this, inshallah azawajal. So let's just kick off with this straight away, inshallah. And I just want to set the scene first of all, because Imam Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī is a very particular kind of scholar. He's not your he's not the type of scholar that is mentioned on the tongues of, you know, the general masses of people. A very particular kind of people will recognize him and his work and his legacy. So and that legacy is particular to a particular type of education and tradition and mawdu'at and subjects, which would be obviously al-Kalam. So before we get into Imam Aḍud-Dīn, it's really important for us to just understand that this Kalam tradition that Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī is a master of, and this Kalam tradition that Allama Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī rahimahullah ta'ala teaches to students like Sharif Jurjani and Allama Taftazani. What is this Kalam tradition? What constitutes the discipline of Ilmul Kalam?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Hamidan wa musallin wa ba'd. Firstly, Jazakumullah khairan for having me on the podcast. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put barakah in it, blessings in it, inshallah ta'ala, and make these sessions a great means of khair and sharing of knowledge, inshallah. It's a great question. Ilmul Kalam has become a little bit popular now. Lots of people interested in it. And I think one of the reasons for that is we've been attempting to treat many contemporary issues of philosophy, of ethics, of epistemology. People are trying to understand knowledge and how they understand things. And I think a lot of Muslims have been trying to refine that within their own tradition. So that's been fantastic. It's been important. It should be encouraged and never discouraged, because we find a lot of the solutions to our problems in this huge, wonderful tradition of Ilm al-Kalam. When we say Ilm al-Kalam, essentially what we mean is philosophical theology. Right. That's what we mean. They called it scholastics in certain circles. But really what it means is theology. It's the study of God, His attributes, the nature of those attributes, the relationship of those attributes to Him, the relationship of those attributes to us, the acts of God, the acts of creation. This is really the role, the ilahiyat. That was the role of theology. Also, prophetology, nubuwwat, the nature of prophets. Does God have to send prophets? No, etc. And also ethics. For example, divine command theory. Is something good because God said it's good? Or does God tell you to do it because it's good? Massive debates historically. And so this was theology studied throughout the medieval period, etc. Philosophical theology from the perspective that they used the language of the hukama. They used the language of the philosophers.
Right.
They incorporated into their discussions logic, essentially Aristotelian, Greek logic. They incorporated discussions on al-Bahath wal-Munadhara, of dialectics.
Right.
They incorporated discussions of political philosophy, for example, etc. So because they were speaking about the same theology of Muslims, but the language that they adopted was the language of the philosophers.
So am I just right to understand that Ilm al-Kalam is not necessarily a set of doctrines
No.
or beliefs, but rather it's rational discourse, and that's
Absolutely.
how we understand it.
So, like if someone looks,
Or what we could say is it's a process of rational discourse.
like for example, somebody could read al-Aqīdah al-Tahawiyah, for example,
Right.
a set of doctrine. Inna Allah wahid, la sharika lahu, wa la shay'in yu'jizuhu, wa la ilaha ghayruhu, etc. Right? It's just a set doctrine. That's important. But kalam is different. Kalam is Inna Allah wahid. Okay, how do we know that? And the tools to know that are not tools that are acceptable only to Muslims, but they have to be musallam, mutually acceptable to both Muslims and non-Muslims.
Right.
Right? So, and that's basically the aql.
Right.
That's the intellect. So the arguments would be rational arguments to establish the existence of God. What are the best arguments to do that? His attributes, again, his relationship to creation, etc., etc., and a countless number of important discussions related that would in some way relate to theology.
Right.
But they would use that language of the philosophers to do so. That's ilm al-kalam. Now, I have to say something. That does not mean that ilm al-kalam is philosophy. That's not the point. The point of ilm al-kalam was to protect the creed of Muslims.
Right.
Right? It wasn't doing philosophy for the sake of it. It wasn't like a philosophy of religion. Whereas if you look at someone like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, even though he dealt with theology, he treated theology, but he did so from the perspective of philosophy, not from the perspective of, I'm trying to protect the creed of the Muslims.
Right.
Whereas if you look at someone like Al-Imam Al-Ghazali, for example, his role was not to be a philosopher. He was not interested in philosophy. He was only interested in philosophy in so much as it assisted him in debunking arguments that were contradictory to the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah.
Right.
So Ilm al-Kalam really is the handmaiden of the creed of the Muslims. That's its role.
Because
that's
at
its
its
function.
inception, we find that the early mutakallimun, they were debating the Mu'tazilites, because the Mu'tazilites initiated this process of rational discourse into theology. What we find is that the mutakallimun developed this science where they're using that tool in order to actually early on refute those sects who claim to be Muslims themselves, using a rational discourse or a process of rational discourse. So even though later on now we use it for maybe debating philosophers, but at its inception it was actually those sects.
And the Khawarij, which are probably the earliest breakaway sect.
Right.
A type of Rawafid, not the sort of Rawafid that you have today, but a type of Rawafid, the Qadariyya, the Jabariyya, the Murji'ah. These were all groups actually before the Mu'tazila. And they had, so the whole sect would be founded upon one issue.
Right.
One issue in which there was dissent and difference of opinion. But they used actually a lot of naqali dalail, i.e. sort of revelatory proofs in trying to debunk those arguments very early on. But what the Mu'tazila did is the Mu'tazila, as we know, and I don't suppose we're going to go into that sort of detail in this podcast, but in summary, the Mu'tazila produced the first Sunni mutakallimun. Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari himself is a product of the Mu'tazili madrasa,
Right.
the nephew of Abu Ali al-Juba'i, obviously the famous Basri school of i'tizal. He's a Mu'tazili who then realizes that there are too many anomalies, and he has a paradigm shift, to use scientific terms, and begins to defend particularly the qudra of Allah. You could say that in that time, the real big debate was about the omnipotence, the power of God. For the Mu'tazila, there was a restriction on the power of God because of yajibu ala Allahi X. You know, this is wajib for Allah. Allah must do what is, aslah for the ibad, what is best for the ibad, etc., etc., etc. So for the Sunni mutakallimun at that time, the function, you could say the primary function of their kalamic efforts was really to reinstate deeply back into Muslim Sunni theology the omnipotence of God.
Right.
That became fundamental.
Right.
Really important. And you'll see that in the early part of the Ash'ari tradition, you'll see that flavor, that it's really about the qudra of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of that, many discussions of al-qada wal-qadr, free will, kasb, all of that really comes as about because of their absolute focus on establishing Allah's absolute qudra and His absolute will. So it's really important to understand the psychology.
I'm going to just summarize those points you mentioned there. I would, from what you've talked about, because you've gone to you've gone to a quite flavoursome discussions throughout the board. But I think if I was to summarize everything what you just said there, what you're essentially saying is that at its core, Kalam is like is a paradigm of thinking that seeks to align with the truth, and that it provides rational explanations for theological concepts that Muslims hold at their core. And this is in response to either sects within Islam that moved away from the truth, or later on for those groups or those beliefs systems that existed outside of Islam altogether.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, like as you say, that I will talk about this in more detail, that this became a worldview. You know, when somebody says, for example, I'm Ash'ari, that's a worldview, because it will cover not only areas of theology, but it will cover areas of morality, of ethics. All of that is going to play a role into this.
Right.
So how do you view the commands of God, for example? You know, so for it to be a paradigm, or for us to call it a paradigm, is really important. And I say that a lot. And the reason why I say that a lot is because when I say I'm Sunni, it's not just a set of doctrine that I subscribe to, but it's an entire prism through which I view the world.
Okay.
I'll give you a simple little example to this. And take, for example, the idea that we believe that God creates the causes and effects. The fact that we hold that position, there's a type of tawheed that we then recognize. That I recognize ultimately there's no power in any cause within all of creation, but it is entirely the power of God. That along with these norms of nature, God is the one in every single moment that is creating. When I say now, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, there's no power or might except through Allah, that is not in some type of secondary way. I don't affirm secondary causation now, by virtue of me being an Ash'ari. I believe in the very moment there is no power or might except Allah. That's a complete rethinking of the way that you view the world. For me personally, and this is going to be subjective to me, I'm not going to put this into the mouths of your viewers, your listeners, but that's an enhanced form of tawheed, because there's wahda or wahdaniyya at the most subtlest levels of existence. That a single buzz of an electron in every single instance and moment is directly caused by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like, that is a very, very deep way of appreciating God's power. And that's just at a purely theological perspective, without even going into the potentials of unlocking these subtleties of tawheed through practices of the saints and of the awliya. But just from a purely rational perspective, look how enhanced one's tawheed would be.
So it's a paradigm of thinking, and this paradigm of thinking is providing rational explanations to us, which aligns with the truth for theological concepts. That's Ilmul Kalam. Can you tell us about some of the developmental phases of Ilmul Kalam? So we know of these early names like Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, but how can we view the development of Kalam through the ages up until now, essentially?
There's been very little work done in this area.
Right.
But you could say that based upon certain observations and a type of inference, that you could infer at least 4 major stages of ilm al-Kalam, broad.
Right.
And I'm being broad here. And I have to oversimplify this a little bit, because there's always nuances and...
Of course,
you know.
yeah.
But really you have a first stage, which is the developmental stage of Kalam. And when we say Kalam here, we're referring basically to Sunni Kalam. I'm not talking about the Mu'tazila.
Right.
They are the first mutakallimun of this ummah. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. The first mutakallimun, Ahlul Kalam, were the Mu'tazila.
And the rest of Kalam was like a response to that, right?
Yes. So, well, you could say that it was a type of offshoot almost, because they came from i'tizal, but they attacked them at the very fundamentals. So the Ash'aris, for example, and the Maturidis are essentially different to the Mu'tazila, isn't based upon principles of usul. They are different.
Right.
But the perspective of the aql playing a role within theology, from that perspective, they're the same. What is that perspective, or what is that role rather? They differ in. Yes. So I'm not saying that the way that the Mu'tazila looked at the role of the aql, that is the way that the Ash'ari looked at the role of the aql. No, that's not the case. But the fact that the aql has an important role, in that they are the same. And some of their ideas overlap, of course, but they differ on, at least you could say, in the very least, the usul khamsa of the Mu'tazila, the Ash'ari differ in them, and that was the main arguments. So that early development period, the likes of Al-Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, the likes of Imam al-Huda, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, the founder of the Maturidi school. And again, we're going to assume that the audience knows all of these details about...
These are groups that coexisted, they influenced each other.
Of course, and the Maturidis are generally Hanafis, etc., etc. So we're going to assume that those things are understood and already known. In that period, Al-Bahili, for example, people like Al-Baghdadi, people like Al-Baqilani, etc. These were the early mutakallimun. And it was, again, very advanced, very technical, very philosophical.
Right.
So when I say early period, I don't mean by any means it was primitive. No. They were very, very much aware of these philosophical discussions, but it was developing. It was in its early stages. Then from the likes of Imam al-Juwayni, from that period, which is basically a generation or two thereafter, in that period from Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni to al-Ghazali, Imam al-Ghazali, to people like al-Razi, al-Amidi, these sort of names that you hear, this is what they call classical kalam. This was it was at its peak from a perspective. It was at its peak. These were people that had refined the discussions of theology. They had written voluminous works, encyclopedic works on the subject. They were people that understood philosophy very, very well. The Maqasid al-Falasifa of Imam al-Ghazali is a good display of that. The Matalib al-Aliyah of Imam al-Razi is a great display of that. And Imam Razi is important. I'm going to get to him at some point as well, because he's important for Ījī.
At this stage, is it also important to note that during this second wave, we find that there's an integration of philosophy into theological discussions?
There is, particularly with Imam al-Razi. There is more, and it's more refined. Like, for example, before this period, and again, I'm oversimplifying, before this period, one of the strongest arguments for Ithbatu Wujudillah was the Dalil al-Huduth. Basically the cosmological argument.
Right.
But Imam al-Razi identifies that argument on its own is not as strong as it could be, but Dalil Imkan is the strongest proof, right? Which is the argument from contingency. And so he refines those arguments and he says, well, actually, the strongest position is the position of combining both of those dalils, both of them together. That's a huge development in terms of the argument. Huge. Perhaps people don't appreciate that now, because as you study the tradition, you study it with hindsight. But at that stage, that was very, very important. So there was Al-Matalib Al-Aliyah, again, is a display of his knowledge of philosophy. It's not even a book of theology. He's not really trying to show you his theology. He's really just outlining all of the major arguments. But this period, again, refined some important books like the Al-Shamil of Al-Jawaini, like the Al-Iqtisad of Al-Ghazali. Of course, they wrote multiple works. Like the Tuhafat al-Falasifa of Imam al-Ghazali, which was very important in making that distinction between the Mutakallimun and the Hukama, the philosophers. And Imam al-Razi comes, as I said, considered to be the end of that classical period and the beginning of a new period. Again, because of his incorporation of more philosophy. This moves on to the likes of a third stage.
That's a good point you mentioned there. Incorporation of more philosophy. So like there's a greater integration.
There's a greater
philosophy
integration.
And theological discourse.
I'll give you an example. For example, his Muhassal. Yeah. So the Muhassal is he writes many books. The Ma'alim Usuluddin is like his matan. It's a mudarras bihi book. It's a book that's studied in the madrasa. His Muhassal is a more expansive work than that, right? It's still, you can argue, a matan. It's not a mutawwal. But it's more expanded. But what he does is he incorporates, and he perhaps may be the first of the Sunni mutakallimun to do this, is that he incorporates umur amma and ontology into this book. So when in the Muhassal, there is at the very beginning discussions on wahda, discussions on kathra, discussions on al-wajib, discussions on al-imkan, discussions on al-istihala. Like those discussions that you expect to find a little later on,
right,
as we'll get to with Al-Ījī, that really begins with Imam Al-Razi.
Right.
So Imam Al-Razi, you can see what he's doing. So if you were to closely follow the development of the Mutakallimun, you can see what they added, what was not there and what they added. Like for example, Imam Al-Ghazali, this is a little bit off topic, but he's the first person, arguably, that incorporates mantiq, logic, into usul. He makes it al-bab al-awwal of the Mustasfa.
Yeah.
Now, well, if you think about it, other mutakallimun were doing this. This wasn't something that was like ta'adil al-ulum of al-Mahbubi, Sadr al-Sharia. The first part of his book is mantiq, So this was something that was there. It was happening. They all have certain aspects, certain idafat, additions that they bring to this tradition. But Imam al-Razi is really important because for him, those discussions on ontology were as important as any other discussion in Kalam. Hence, he brought it into the Muhassal.
Interesting. So that takes us on to so with the likes of Imam Razi's Muhassal, that opens up this third wave, and you went on to that.
So you can argue that a third aspect was a sort of a more open door policy to philosophy, right? And a great example of this is the likes of Imam Ad-Dawani, Jalaluddin Ad-Dawani. Imam Ad-Dawani is, if you look, for example, we have, do you mind if I show it?
Yeah, of course.
So, for example, you have, this is just the one, you can get better editions of this, so I'm not promoting this particular edition. Maybe I'll cover it like that, so you can't see it, right? But this is Dawani's commentary on Al-Aqā'id al Aḍudīyyah.
Which we're going to get to.
So Imam Al-Ījī, Now, Imam Al-Ījī is more of a traditional Ash'ari, even though he's earlier, yes? He's more of a traditional Ash'ari. Dawani is a little bit more Razian, but a little bit more even than that. I'll give you an example. Imam Al-Razi, in some of his works, affirms the thubutiyya of something that is not mawjud. Yeah. Now, anyone listening that araf man araf, these discussions, but he in one place he affirms even the muthul al-aflatuniyya, the Platonic forms, right? Now that is a really important distinction between the mutakallimun and the hukama.
Right.
But yet there's a qawl of Imam Razi on it, which means that there was more nuance in their work, in their thinking, that they weren't, for them, ilm al-kalam was not dogmatic. And I'm not trying to put down anything here in terms of our aqaid.
Aqaid
are different, that's musallam. But in terms
Kalam
of
itself is not
aqaid, of
remember,
course.
it's a paradigm of thinking that's already established already.
Exactly.
And the reason why the philosophy exists in the first place is because the Mu'tazilites began to use rational arguments.
Aywa.
Because we had to respond to them to defend the Aqā'id, which is why Sunni ulama adopted it as a process in order to defend Sunni Aqā'id. This is the whole reason why it's there. If that never happened, Muslims would have never engaged with philosophy.
Well,
that might disappoint some people, but that's the reality.
No, absolutely. No, absolutely. It was you could say it was mustahab li ghayrihi.
Right.
Yeah, or even wajib li ghayrihi, of course. You know, because rad an shubahat or daf an shubahat is from Muhammad-Aḍud-Dīn.
Yes.
No, there's no denying that. It's important. Yeah, to push away doubts and stuff. So, but it was, if it's wajib, it's li ghayrihi, not li dhatihi. No, not because of itself, due to something else. Like ma yusilu ila al-wajib wajib, right? It's wajib for your aqaid to be correct. And if for some people the means of that was engaging in a type of philosophy, then that becomes wajib.
Right.
Yeah, because raf' an shubahat is very important. Ala kullin, so for example, you got al-Aqā'id al Aḍudīyyah. It's a tiny book and it's a wonderful book, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly, right? So Jalaluddin al-Dawani writes a commentary on it. In this commentary, and this is it has the hashiya of Galambawi. You can get better prints with 4 different hawashi on it. Now, and I recommend that, right? Dawani in this, when speaking at times, will resort to the philosophers. He will resort to the Sufis. And when I say Sufis here, I mean the philosophical Sufis.
Falsafat al-tasawwuf.
Yeah, falsafat at-tasawwuf. He will refer to the kashf of some of the awliya, that some of the awliya had kashf on this masala. He'll mention it. Like it's there.
Right.
Like for example on the mas'ala of when talking about safa, talking about like folly with regards to God, hasha wa kalla ma'adallah. But in that section, if somebody wants to quickly go and have a look, you'll see that he has a discussion on kashf of the awliya in that. That wasn't found in the books. Well, it was, and so certain books, like even of Imam al-Ghazali, you will find that he talks in that Sufi language because he was a Sufi. But when he wrote the Iqtisad, he wrote as a pure theologian. In other works, you will see him speaking about the mujarradat, you know, these the objects that are thabit but don't have wujud, for example. You'll see him speaking in that Sufi language. Of course you will, right? But as a book of theology, like, did they incorporate that as a way of treating theology? It wasn't so apparent.
But it starts becoming apparent.
Yeah, it starts becoming apparent. So I'm not saying it wasn't there. And again, I'm saying I'm oversimplifying just to make it easier for the student.
Yeah.
But it becomes more apparent with Dawani. And Dawani's student, who's very famous, is Qadi Hussein al-Mabzi. When he wrote his commentary on the Hidayat al-Hikmah of al-Abhari, which is a book in pure philosophy, right? He actually intended to have a synthesis. There's been many syntheses in our tradition. The Ash'ari Maturidi synthesis that took place particularly in Cairo, in Egypt. But he wanted to achieve a synthesis between Ash'ariism, Maturidism, i.e. the Mutakallimun, and Tasawwuf, and Falsafa. He wanted there to be a synthesis. That was his objective in the book. In fact, if somebody wants to see that, just go and read the last line of the book, where he summarizes this point here, right? So that was his, and which is interesting because that takes us on to our 4th phase, right? Because Mabzi is a very popular book in the subcontinent, in the Farangi Mahall tradition,
Right.
along with Shams Bazigha and Mullah Sadra and some other works like Abdul Haq Khairabadi also has a commentary, Hidayat al-Hikmah, etc. Hamdallah, no, that's Sulam. But these works became very, very popular. Like they were sort of the bread and butter of the Farangi Mahalli intellectual tradition.
Which is interesting now because that, what you just said there, opens up a 4th phase.
Yes. So this is like...
Or a 4th wave.
Arguably a 4th phase. Yes, arguably. I'm not going to deny that I'm oversimplifying. There will always be nuances, subtleties. Somebody will be able to say, but look, so-and-so said this. I agree. I'm sure people said things. But we're talking about as a broad category. Right. Now this Farangi Mahal sort of tradition, I will say, was always there in the Ottoman tradition. Yeah, so I'm excluding the Ottomans from this. Because the Ottomans, since their very inception, and we talked about this in a couple of sessions that we've done for different places, we talked about this, that with the inception of the Ottoman Madrasa being by Dawood al-Kaysari, who was obviously a student of al-Kashani, a student of al-Kunawi, a student of al-Shaykh al-Akbar ibn Arabi,
who we visited, mashallah.
Whom we visited, mashallah, together. A wonderful visitation as well. But Dawood al-Kaysari is the Bani. We visited the madrasa as well, and in Iznik, and he was Sufi, philosophically Sufi as well. And so that strand or that flavor permeates throughout the Ottoman tradition thereafter, up until the very end. You had some detractors, of course you did. But by and large, that was the general theme of the Ottoman.
That's ma'ruf. That's ma'ruf.
That's ma'ruf. That's ma'ruf. That's known.
What's known a lot less is
the Farangi
Mahallis.
Well, nobody knows about the Farangi Mahallis.
What's happening in this fourth wave there?
So nobody knows about the Farangi Mahallis except the people that studied the Farangi Mahal tradition. And that's it. And most of the works taught in the Farangi Mahal tradition, the Kutub Mutadawila, are still technically in manuscript form for most people. But those makhtutat were basically photocopied, and they're the ones that all of us had in our Dars-i-Nizami classes, right? Because they were not Muhaqqiq, and then matbu', sort of, and put out there, people know a lot less about them. But it's changing. That's changing now. There's more people working in this area. Now, in this area, look, Mebzi is a popular book. Mullah Sadra is a Shi'i philosopher. Now, people have to understand that. Yet his book is there, right? This is in the Damat tradition, the Shirazi tradition. Like, this is an Iranian tradition that finds its way into the subcontinent. The influence into the subcontinent from Tashkent, from the Shirazi Madrasa are apparent. They're very, very famous. It's known. Also, what people have to understand is that you've got very, very early influences of a Shaykh al-Akbar in the subcontinent. In fact, it's argued, and I'm not going to speak more on it now because there's a little bit more tahqiq that needs to be done on this, right? But it's argued that since the very beginning of Islam in the subcontinent, after the Arab conquests, after the Sahaba, the first time that they came in, like Muhammad bin Qasim, and they came into Sindh, the second time, since the very second time that Islam came into this part of the world, it came in with the influence of a Shaykh al-Akbar. Yeah,
that's right.
So and not just that, but the people that carried the banner of Islam were the awliya.
Right.
The most famous individuals, personalities that spread Islam throughout the Muslim world of the subcontinent were all awliya. It was your Mu'inuddin Chishtis, it was your Ali al-Hajwaris, it was your Nizamuddin awliya. More towards, let's say, Pakistan, it's the likes of Fariduddin, Ganshakar, al-Mas'ud, etc. These were in Kashmir. You had the visitation of Ali al-Hamdani, very famous Shafi'i Sufi, etc. If you look in the south of India, it was the Habaib, the Malibari, the Shafi'is, that came in. These were Yemeni Sadat, So the subcontinent, its real beginning of Islam was a Sufi Islam. Yeah. And that continued. So that's interesting. Now, these books that come in, that make up the Ma'qulat tradition of the Farangi Mahall, the likes of Qutbuddin al-Sihalvi, I have only a part of it, the Makhtut, only part of it, right? The rest of it's lost. I have Qutbuddin al-Sihalvi, who is arguably the founding father of this Farangi Mahal tradition, right? He has a hashiya on this, on Dawani, right? Because we know the Sharh al-Jaliyah was a very popular book in Dars-i-Nizami once upon a time.
And still is taught in some places.
It is. He had a hashiya on that, along with many others, right? So they were Mebzi, numerous Hawashi and Mebzi, numerous Hawashi and Mullah Sadra, numerous Hawashi and all of these books of hikmah. And as we know, Shams Bazigha is an independent book written within the Farangi Mahal tradition. So these, for them, this was very much Kalam. Kalam for them was, and I shared it with you once upon a time, where Qutbuddin al-Sihalwi, in his hashiya on Dawani, where he quotes Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, Ibn Sina, al-Shaykh al-Akbar, al-Suhrawardi al-Maqtul, all 5 of them on one page, and then moves on.
Are you referring to Qutbuddin Shaheed? Or
Qutbuddin
Nizamuddin
al-Shaheed.
Sihalwi?
Qutbuddin al-Shaheed.
Qutbuddin Shaheed, the father.
The father, not Nizamuddin.
Yeah.
So Nizamuddin al-Sihalwi, he himself has Hawashi
That's
also
right, yeah.
on the book, right?
Right, that's right.
But what I'm trying to say is, and Nizamuddin al-Sihalwi, as you know, is arguably the muassis of the madrasa, because he lays out the curriculum.
So-
But the argument, just to finish this point, that it's very difficult to divorce from this tradition the role of an open door policy when it comes to the different philosophies. That doesn't mean that they adopted all of the philosophies. No. Now, I don't know if you're going to ask me this question, but if you were to say, what's the key distinguishing function or the distinguishing factor between this tradition and the previous ones, I would say it is a wider epistemology. The role of kashf,
Right.
the role of wijdan.
Right.
Was that not discussed in the earlier books of Kalam?
And did that not exist in the Ottoman tradition?
Of course it did. It was there in the books of Kalam. But I will give you arguments for why that was central to the Farangi Mahall tradition. Take, for example, an important heir to the Farangi Mahall tradition was Al-Allama Fazl-e-Haq Khairabadi. Rahimullah.
After whom this whole institution is named.
MashaAllah, tabarakallah, right? Allama Fazl Khairabadi, rahimahullah, in his Rawd al-Majud fi Tahqiq Maslat al-Wujud, he said something that really, it was like an excellent summary of this whole tradition. He said, when dealing with the issue of wahda in wujud, he said, the haq is with the Sufiya Safiya. The truth is with the Sufis and their mukashafat. Yeah? But we are not going to talk about that. We are going to talk at the level of the uqul mutawassita. The middle intermediary intelligence, which is the aql of the hukama, the philosophers. He's not the only one. Mullah Hassan, all of the books they mention, all of this. Right. It's all there. Uqul mutawassita. In fact, there's a brother right now in, I think, Canada. He's working on just the concept of uqul mutawassita in the Farangi Mahall tradition. There's also people are, mashallah, becoming more mutawajjih towards this khair. May Allah Ta'ala make us wasa'il of that. Ameen. Now, so that opened epistemology, where we accept that. And in fact, he goes on to say, I agree with it because there's ijma' of the Sufis on this. Look at that statement. Ijma' of the Sufis on this. But I won't, he's saying, I am not going to evoke that as my evidence. I'm going to defend the position upon which there is ijma' of the Sufis using the uqul mutawassita, and I'm going to answer it from the perspective that I'm a Maturidi, and I will respond to this position, and I will defend their position. So that means he has full taslim and submission to the ijma' on the kashf of the awliya, and he's only using a bit like how I have no doubt in the doctrine of Islam because it's in the Quran, but I'm going to use language that's musallam between you and me to defend it. Similarly, Khairabadi is saying what? Rahimahullah, he is saying that I have full taslim on the ijma' on the Sufis on this, that if they said it, it's haqq. But in order to convince you, for iqna' of you, I'm going to use something which is musallam between us, which is the aql. Really interesting.
There's two points here interesting. One point I want to make as a disclaimer as well is that when we're talking about the incorporation of books like Mullah Sadra or Sharh al-Tahzib by Mullah Yazdi into the Nizami syllabus, that's not to say that they're openly endorsing Shi'i theology, of course. And secondly, what's interesting about what you're mentioning about this fourth phase, if I was
At-Tusi, Sayyid al-Sharif has a commentary on the Tajreed al-Aqā'id of At-Tusi. Right. That doesn't mean that he had, in fact, where he differs with them, he does not on him.
Right, that's right. So what we're saying over here is that this Farangi Mahalli period, this of the Dars-i-Nizami institutions. So this Farangi Mahalli period, this Dars-i-Nizami syllabus curriculum period that we're talking about, with the likes of Nizamuddin al-Sihalwi, and all the way to the likes of Allama Fazl Khairabadi, Allama Abdul Haq Khairabadi, and then the branches thereof. What we're essentially is saying is that in this period, it marks a period of open synthesis between and a wider metaphysical framework, including falsafat al-tasawwuf.
Absolutely.
And we're seeing it in a way that's not been seen previously, which is why we're establishing that this is like a fourth wave.
Not in that way. You could say the Ottomans, for
with
sure.
the exception that the Ottoman world, this was happening anyway.
Yes, but
you know.
even with the Ottomans, you could say that there was a heavy focus on falsafat al-tasawwuf, but how much of this was manifest in a single book of theology?
Right.
You see,
Like
so
the way you're seeing it with
you've
the
got the
Farangi-
Fanaris,
Yeah.
right? You've got
Right.
the Fanaris. Examples of this are like Ramadan Effendi. Ramadan Effendi has a very famous hashiya on the Sharh al-Aqā'id. He will do this. He will do this. So it's not like they didn't do it, but it's almost like the Farangi Mahall. They didn't sort of have books of tasawwuf and then books of falsafa and then books of kalam. It was that they just merged them all together within the text itself.
The way that's happening and at the speed it's happening and the period it's happening in, it still makes it unique from even the Ottomans, I believe, because when you're talking about Mullah Fanari, what period are we talking about? That's
Well, we're talking about
at least
sort of, this is before the time of Mehmed Fatih.
Sultan Mehmed
14th,
Fatih.
so about 13th
And we're talking
century.
about Fazl Khairabadi. It's like we can almost feel him, touch him, because this is just just prior to 1857 and the war of independence, like that.
Well,
entire
even now,
tradition.
even the Mashaykh now, like
Even
even
the
our
Mashaykh now.
teachers,
That's right.
it's the same.
This
it's
is
the
the same, and that still exists
It still exists
and is being taught
Absolutely.
as we speak.
as we speak.
Yeah, as we speak. So
It's
that's
not
interesting.
It's not a dead tradition.
That's right.
It's a living tradition.
So this takes me on to a very important question. Sometimes this question is asked. I remember actually asking this question to your teacher, Sheikh Hamza Bakri, not long ago, which was that in the face of ever-evolving modern philosophies, the likes of which we see today, does ilm al-Kalam al-Qadim, this traditional ilm al-Kalam, does it still retain its relevance? Like, can we find refutations and arguments crafted by scholars like Allama Taftazani, Mir Sayyid al-Jurjani rahimahullah, that can offer sufficient ammunition against contemporary philosophies? Essentially, it's the skepticisms and Kant's philosophy and everything else that we see today, in the world around us. Is traditional ilmul kalam relevant in the world that we live in right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Like that's the short answer. Absolutely. There's no doubt. There's no new philosophy. There's no new philosophy. I mean, they're talking about discussions of divine command theory, as we were talking about, right? Before, but this was a huge bab of tahsin wa taqbih dealt with. We had the Sharh al-Aqā'id class last week, was on al-Khabar al-Sadiq and the epistemology of testimony. And so what I did for the students is I read for them a passage from a really good article written about the epistemology of testimony. And in there he said it's an area that's been neglected, yet it's so central. And I highlighted the fact that, look, what was considered to be neglected, did we neglect it? When Taftazani treats epistemology as bab al-ilm in the Sharh al-Aqā'id, in between, central, literally central, in between al-Hawas, al-Salima, and al-Aql, he treats al-Khabar al-Sadiq,
Right, that's right.
which is the epistemology of testimony.
Right.
And many of the interesting objections that he makes in the article were treated by Taftazani and others, of course, but treated with great length. In fact, at one point he laments, where are the meditations on testimony, like works called the Meditations of Testimony? I said, well, you should look at the books of Ulum al-Hadith.
Right.
And interestingly, even in the epistemology of testimony today, it's largely based upon lone reports, ahad, what we call ahad. And they debate these discussions about if it's one, if it was multiple people, gharib, aziz, right? Is there context to it? Are there qara'in, corroborating evidences? These are all things that were treated with a huge level of due diligence within our tradition. Hadith, both hadith, ulum al-hadith tradition and the kalam tradition. Like for example, the Nukhbatul Fikr on the Nuzhatul Nadar, fi Tawdih Nukhbatul Fikr, Ibn Hajar, rahimahullah ta'ala, the beginning section is a treatment of epistemology. What is ilm daruri? What is ilm kasb iktisabi? What is the relationship between daruri and nadari? Is there a type of nadari that is daruri? Like all of these taqsimat that he's giving you, that's epistemology of testimony. And he gives a great amount of focus, or focuses greatly on that. And at Taftazani, and then he mentions it in the article, there were so many things, I'm not going to go through he gives an example of, well, just because the testimony has come to you, it doesn't mean that the content of that testimony is also acceptable.
Right.
And I thought, al-Khabar al-Mutawatir and Khabar Rasul. That's the whole distinction. That when he says, the Matin, Ayah Nasafi says, that al-Khabar al-Sadiq is ala naw'ain, one is al-Mutawatir and the other one is Khabar Rasul. That's what he's talking about. That just because something has been reported through mass transmission, it's only the malfuz that is daruri, but the ma'qul, if somebody was to report something like an aqli thing, it's not acceptable. It has to be hissi. It's a discussion.
Right.
It has to be known through the senses. Furthermore, if it's khabar rasul, it's istidlali. Why? Because you trust the messenger who's al-mu'ayyid bil-mu'jaza.
Right.
So it's like, I've accepted the naql, the Quran, mass transmission from the Prophet. But how do I know it's true? Well, this is a man that was assisted with a miracle. And that can only be a prophet. Therefore, this is the book given to us, or transmitted to us from a prophet. Therefore, the contents of it are all going to be true.
Right.
So it's so interesting that what he was lamenting was something that our ulama had treated 1,000 years ago.
Flourishing in our tradition.
Flourishing.
Right.
Look at the size of some of our works in ulum al-hadith. And the focus that they put on qat'i and dhanni.
That's right, yeah.
It's unfortunate. I hope you don't mind me saying this on your podcast, but that you do have certain Muslims today, unfortunately, who are anti-ilm al-kalam and anti-everything, and they'll be reading, there's a book being read where they talk about al-qat'i wa dhanni, and they'll say, لا يوجد فرق بين القطع والظن إذا ثبت عن النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام فهو قطعي. Right? Okay, now you need to explain to me what you mean by ثبت عن النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام. Do you mean ثبت بالقطع or do you mean ثبت بالظن? Right? Like, is there not self-evidently the case? Is it not that there's a difference between a lone report and a mass report? Something that's been a testimony given by one person and a testimony that's been given by a huge number of people, tabaqa ba'da tabaqa, in each generation. Is there not a difference? I'll give you another example. They talk about, and so now in testimony they're talking about the idea that even science, no scientist can do science without depending upon the works of the previous scientists. You know, a scientist today isn't doing every single scientific experiment ever done before. They're basing their new experiments based upon the old experiments, which means that they trust the testimony. Your birthday. When's your birthday? Your birthday is the 30th of October. How do you know? I've got a birth certificate. How can you trust it? How can you trust the doctors? How can you trust your parents? Are they your parents? Have you done a DNA test? Did you ever feel like doing a DNA test? These discussions that are being had now as a philosophical discussion were absolutely, as you say, flourishing within the Islamic Kalam tradition.
It's interesting because, like, what comes to mind straight away is those modern philosophies that assert that there's no truth beyond personal perception, obviously, which is highly problematic, obviously that can lead to anarchy. What we find is that the reason they've come to those conclusions is because of a lack of clear thought process. But what's interesting is that if you look at the traditional books of Ilm al-Kalam, the first thing they begin discussing is Haqā'id al Aḍudīyyah. So it's like, even though these are modern philosophies that exist that have this batil idea, how do you now navigate in trying to come up with some response to the heart of their criticisms, to their belief system? Well, what we find is that in Ilm al-Kalam al-Qadim, those very same books like Sharh al-Aqā'id al that are taught in the traditional seminaries, the very first lesson and sabak there, which is Haqā'id al Thabita is the answer that will rebuttal the heart of the whole argument.
Yep. And what's interesting was,
so you can see that the relevance is there on page 1.
You know, in some of the books in Kalam, they begin with what is awwalu wajib, and they say awwalu wajib another, awwalu wajib another.
Right.
Okay, the first obligation is rational reflection. Like, get this done, get this out the way. Yajibu ala kulli mukallaf.
Right.
What? That he knows about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what is wajib, what is jaiz, etc. Haqā'id al Thabita wal ilmu biha mutahaqqaq. Right? If you look at the greatest discussions of philosophy today, they are to do with idealism, realism.
That's right.
The idea, is this existence, does it exist outside of my mind or not?
Right.
And before that, can I even know it? The most fundamental discussions in Kalam are on that.
And relativism comes into this as well.
We talked about al-Muhassil of al-Razi. Let's discuss the nature of the universe.
Right.
Before you can even get into it, let's discuss the nature of the universe.
Right.
I'll tell you the real problem, and I don't want people to get somebody to get upset by this, but this is what I genuinely believe. That I think that the people that criticize Ilm al-Kalam al-Qadim are the people that never studied it. Or they are people that have bought into the narrative that metaphysics is not important, physics is the only thing that's important. Like what happened in the 20th century, 19th century, 20th century, with Yani al-Kalam or Ilm al-Kalam al-Jadid, right? Shibli Nu'mani, Abdu in Egypt, Rashid Rida, etc., Ismail Izmirli in Turkey. With these individuals, what happened was they were so blinded by the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution that they thought, well, real progress is in technological advancements, scientific advancements. And you guys are sat in the madrasa talking about the existence of God, or in terms of the existence, the nature of being. Who cares about that? That's all theory. It's all abstract. Why are you dealing with the metaphysics? Deal with the physics. Let's look in that direction. And so that sort of, you could say, inferiority complex of many people against the West and the scientific revolution, because for the West, they were done with God. So they weren't interested in metaphysics. They were done with him. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. We don't care about God. We don't care about metaphysics. We don't care about angels. We don't care about any of that. For us, it's about science, physics, the universe, atoms, etc. Which many of these things are treated, obviously, in the books of Kalam. But
and in the books of Falsafa, like the later period. So if you got like Mullah Mibzi in his book of Falsafa, and it's the same with all books of Falsafa. They begin with Ilm al-Tabi'iyat. Like Ilahiyat, they discuss Ilahiyat.
Here I could maybe agree that when they say, oh, the Tabi'iyat of the books of philosophy could do with some updating. No problem. Write a hashiya on it, right? Like, write a hashiya on it, write a shar on it. No problem. Do you think the Islamic tradition didn't develop? Ideas develop. They get more refined. That's
like there may be some kind of discussion in Madda that may exist that, doesn't...
Hayula, right? Everyone's like Hayula, talking about Hayula, this idea of, form and matter, hylomorphism. This is so out of date. There's a revival of hylomorphism right now. There's a revival of it. That original idea of the debate between Plato and Aristotle, the idea of focusing more on the physics or more on the metaphysics, or is there Platonic forms, is there not Platonic forms, is everything only what exists, and there's no such thing as a thing that could be without being in existence and have some nature in that way. That's the same even today, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that, for example, there was a recent discussion that came out in physics of bundle theory. The idea that there's no madda, there's no jawhar, there's no sort of substance, but that the universe is just a collection of accidents. Well, this was put forward by Nizam 1,000 years ago. Mu'tazili, bundle theory, 1,000 years ago. You will never know truly the benefits of Ilm al-Kalam until you study it. And so what happened to a lot of these guys is they thought, well, we need to be focusing on building machines and trains and planes, and that's what we need to do. All this metaphysics is just a waste of time.
I
Like,
remember yeah, sorry. So you were saying?
Like, if that is your view and you want to focus more on physics, great. I think that's really important for ilm al-kalam to establish the contingency of the universe through different arguments.
An avenue.
Ahlan wa sahlan bik. But you know, those metaphysical discussions are important and they haven't changed. But metaphysics dropped in terms of its quality. It hasn't increased in these last 100, 200 years.
Because it's interesting. I remember once we had a discussion where while you were in the Econ Madrasa, and you said, look, Allama Taftazani in the Sharh al-Aqā'id al-Nasafiyya, when he says qala ba'duhum, that ba'duhum is this modern philosophy today. Yeah. When he says ba'duhum here and he gives an ilzami jawab to them in this place, that ba'duhum is this modern philosophy. This is Kant's philosophy. This is so and so's philosophy. So you find that really speaking, what you're trying to say here is that all these modern philosophies are actually rooted in some form of traditional philosophy, and traditional philosophy is being dealt with by the Muslim theologians for over 1,000 years.
Is there room for work? Of course there is.
Right.
There's always room that you can add and you can develop.
And this is what we're trying to encourage.
This is what we're trying to encourage, exactly.
Right.
No one is saying that that's all the work done. All you've got to do now is naql al-ibara, No, that's not what anyone's saying. But the idea is that
even to do that right now would be
mashallah, would be quite an achievement.
It would be an achievement, right?
And but the idea is that exactly as you say, exactly as you say, that what the idea is that you take what the ancestors have written, and some of them were only writing 100 years ago, develop, if there are places to develop, maneuver arguments and put them tatbiqan into their right places, right, according to the right philosophy. I mean, Sabri Effendi, for example, Shaykh al-Islam, Mustafa Sabri Effendi, he wasn't writing in a vacuum. He was depending upon his tradition. Like Sabri Effendi, when he's having a discussion with Kant or Hume or Hegel, Nietzsche, whoever it may be, he's not writing out of just sat there and studied it all himself and now he's gone for it. No, he's rooted in his tradition of Kalam. And that tradition of Kalam is allowing him to engage with new... I don't say that they're new ideas. I say they're formed differently. There's a new tawjih on the argument. And so now you need to introduce perhaps a new tawjih on your argument to be able to rebuttal that. But
so I think we're getting close to a checkpoint here. I think if we were to summarize what we've talked about here so far, we could summarize in these words, and you can add to it or take away if you'd like. What we're saying here is that Kalam serves as a paradigm, a framework for understanding the world that aligns with its true essence. It provides a means to navigate the complexities of modern life while upholding the principles of sound reasoning and logical argumentation. So that's where we're up to so far. Just one thing before we get to our checkpoint. You've talked about this fourth developmental phase of Kalam, which was represented by the Farangi Mahallis. I think it will be a good idea just at this point. You can obviously elaborate further, but they're known as the Farangi Mahallis because of the Farangi Mahall, which was this palace that was gifted to the children of Qutb-ud-Din al-Shaheed after he was martyred by the great Aurangzeb Alamgir, the great Sultan of the Mughal Empire. And when he established this curriculum of education for the modern scholar of that period in the subcontinent, those who graduated from Nizamuddin's curriculum, particularly in this palace that was gifted to him, the Farangi Mahall, those graduates were known as the Farangi Mahallis. This period sees great, intellectual progress, and what we're establishing is that it's the fourth phase in the Kalamic process, and we want to dedicate another podcast or a series of podcasts inshallah, just on the Farangi Mahallis, because I believe with the Khairabadi Institute, the entire corpus of the work of Khairabadi Institute will just be to reintroduce this entire tradition again to the world. Unfortunately, that's something that is left yet to do. Absolutely. But fortunately, Allah Ta'ala's giving tawfiq for us to give tawajjuh towards that and to help in into serve rather in whatever capacity we can. But for now, can you just very briefly just introduce these Farangi Mahallis to the audience, to people who are watching, and briefly display their sophisticated approach to learning and teaching the Islamic sciences, in particular Kalam. What was the sophisticated approach that they employed in teaching the sciences in general, and particularly Ilm al-Kalam?
Well, I think that would be a book there, that question. That's a PhD right there, isn't it? So I don't know if I can do justice to it, but I think, as you alluded to earlier as well, they were great fuqaha. I mean, people forget that, by the way.
Right.
So I think the discourse is going in the direction of they're great in the ma'qulat. Yes, they are, but they were also great in fiqh. They were really, really strong in fiqh. They were muftiyan.
Right.
They were very. I mean, when we talk about Khairabadi was a mufti.
Right.
He was a mufti.
Yeah.
In fact, it's his fatwa against the British that actually gets him incarcerated into the Andaman Islands,
Right.
Where he subsequently, leaves this dunya. So like they were people of fatwa. So I thought I'd put that out there, and I think even if you go down from the Khairabadis, and into places like Bareilly, arguably one of the main heirs of the Khairabadi tradition. Again, muftis. They were muftis. So I just thought I'd put that out there. I don't want people to think that these were sort of just philosophers sat there just engaging in futile philosophical discourse, and no, they were ulama. And I have to, if you want to know what they were like, they were ulama. They were people of sharia, people of deen. They were people of suluk. They were chishtis, thumma, qadiris.
Yeah.
Right? They were people of tariqah, sohbah. They had Fazl Khairabadi has a diwan in which much of the poetry is dedicated to the love of Allah, but to the love of the Prophet ﷺ, to suluk, etc. These were righteous ulama, right? So I'll put that out there right away, just in case people think that they were some type of rationalist hukama.
Yeah.
No, they were ulama.
So even what you mentioned there, like the ulama of Bareilly would have essentially been heirs to that Farangi Mahalli tradition.
Absolutely.
So in a sense, they're an offshoot, like the Khairabadis are an offshoot of that tradition.
Hey, well, that's the position. I mean, Dr. Asad Q. Ahmed from Berkeley, he has a work on this, and he makes that link between the Farangi Mahallis to the Khairabadis, and he says that from the Khairabadis, the only one of the main heirs actually goes into Bareilly. Obviously, we know that also there are others, like for example the Badayunis, the Bandialvis.
Right.
These are all traditions actually, So
And many of them exist today.
Many of them exist today. So maybe the work that he produced, there could be additional works to highlight also the fact that there were other heirs, not just Bareilly, but also these other ones as well that were very interesting. I mean, to be honest, even places like Golra are very much heirs of that tradition. I mean,
no doubt.
yeah,
100%.
maybe they took a certain flavor of that, but they are the same sort of heirs. It's very interesting. This is really interesting. Someone that's interested in intellectual history, this is super interesting. Tayyib, along with that, the what's telling as well is the fact that up until the time of Shah Waliullah al-Dehlwi, rahmatullah alayh, you only have, I think it's 2 books of hadith. You have the Mishkat, Mishkat al-Masabih, and also I think you have Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. You have the I don't know if it was Ma'ani al-Athar or it was just the Mishkat, right? But I remember it being, there was just 2.
It was definitely the Mishkat.
The Mishkat was definitely there. So they didn't have a strong focus on hadith in terms of the curriculum. They knew hadith and they studied hadith. In terms of curriculum, the idea of the Dawra hadith, the idea of the 6 books plus the Muwatta, plus the of Imam Muhammad, plus the like Ma'ani al-Athar of Imam al-Tahawi, and all these additional books that come in, they come in with Shah Waliullah. Because Shah Waliullah's, again, he's a perfect display of the Farangi Mahal, which is about development and progress. So as and when time requires something, then you should introduce something.
That's not to say that the Farangi Mahallis was some kind of weak in hadith.
No. That's not. But that wasn't their takhassus in terms of the curriculum. It wasn't. They produced commentaries. There's many works that came out of this tradition, but that wasn't their takhasus. Their takhasus was in fiqh largely and usul al-fiqh, hence why they were strong in usul. I mean, the idea of books like Usul al-Shashi as only a primer, Nur al-Anwar, al-Husami, the Tawdih. I mean, these are not like small books in Usul al-Fiqh, right? And they're studied in a certain way. Likewise, Ma'qulat. Now, the way that they teach, and this is displayed in with great glory in the Khairabadi tradition, it's a type of Socratic method of teaching. What's referred to as the Socratic method is where the assumption is that the student knows and you're eliciting that information from them. Because for Socrates, he believed that all knowledge was sort of already deposited within the human being, but they're unaware of it. So they never needed dalil, they only needed tanbih, right, to elicit that out of them. So it became known as the Socratic method, which is basically what the Arabs call fanqalaqa, fa'in qulta qultu, if you say then I say, and what we had the i'tiraz jawab sort of method, traditionally.
So what's interesting is this whole i'tiraz jawab tradition that we have in the Farangi Mahallis is not something which is just necessarily just unique to them, but you find that it has roots even in the Arab tradition.
Absolutely,
itself,
yeah.
And also with Socrates
Absolutely.
thousands of years earlier.
Yeah. This is
actually a style of learning.
It's a style of learning.
So
it's a pedagogy. It's a pedagogy.
So there's a distinctive teaching style that exists in the Farangi Mahallis that makes it very unique. Because and this is something that I found interesting, is because I was reading somewhere that Mullah Nizamuddin Al-Sihalwi himself, what he would do is he would take the two most difficult books in each subject, and he would take the responsibility of teaching that and imparting that to the students. Why? Because once they've studied those two books in a very particular style of teaching, with himself teaching that to the students, what would happen is that the entire library essentially opens up to those students in that madrasa. And it was interesting because that's one point. And the second point, what I found interesting with the Farangi Mahallis is that with Allama Qutbuddin al-Shaheed, and you mentioned him early on, with his commentaries on books like Allama Dawani's Sharh on Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī's Aqā'id al Aḍudīyyah, what you find is that he sought to integrate the advancements of the rational sciences into meaning Mullah Qutbuddin is somebody who sought to integrate these advancements in the rational sciences into some form of a syllabus, but that really took off with Nizamuddin Al-Sihalwi later on. So Nizamuddin Sihalwi formalizes this education program known as the Dars-i-Nizami, from which the Farangi Mahallis are graduating. But he's essentially, what I'm trying to say here is, he's essentially building on the work of his own father, who was already doing this in some
and
form.
Not just that, but Qutbuddin al-Shaheed is himself not working in a vacuum.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Like, this was the tradition.
And as we know, their sanad is, if you look at the sanad of the Farangi Mahallis, you find that their sanad is essentially retracing back to Sharif al-Jurjani, Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī, all the way back to Allama Razi himself, Imam Ghazali, Imam Juwayni, and then essentially their main teacher would be the Imam of the Ahl Sunnah, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari himself. And these asanid are there; they exist today with the names of those scholars.
And what's interesting as well, by the way, is even though they call themselves Maturidis, their sanad is Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, which is very interesting.
And that's interesting.
Hold on, not just that, but it's just very interesting, right? So to any zealous Hanafis, Maturidis, that's quite an interesting thought. But I'll tell you what's really interesting here is that the Maturidi school stopped at a certain point in its development. Like the magnum opus of the Maturidi school is going to be Tabsurat al-Adillah, for example, published now. You get it in 2 volumes, some 3 volumes. The Umda was there, obviously Al-Lamashi, the Tamheed, obviously the Kitab al-Tawheed of Imam Abu al-Hasan, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi himself. And there's a PhD on why the Maturidi school didn't pick up the way the Ash'ari school did. One of the reasons that they give is because the Kitab al-Tawheed was actually a very difficult book. It was written in difficult language. But one of the reasons you can argue is that there was just more ihtimam given by the Ash'ari scholars. Like the Maturidis didn't have a Juwayni, they didn't have a Ghazali, they didn't have a Razi, They just didn't. So by the time you get to the likes of Ibn Humam, etc. in Egypt, where there's, where in Azhar you've got a Shafi and you've got a Hanafi teaching, then you have the process of Mazj.
Yeah.
Right, and then when the phase thereafter comes of reviving Maturidism, what books do you see that arise? Fiqh al-Akbar of Abu Hanifa, Mullah Ali Qari's commentary on it,
right.
Badul Amali,
right.
Turns up, the commentaries on Badul Amali begin to turning up.
Yeah.
So you sort of looking at it, you're thinking to yourself, it's like there's a phase where the Maturidi books are sort of rare now. And there's not, the Maturidis don't have your Laqanis and your Sanusis, they don't have your Bajuris, they don't have these, that period, that type of Ashari Kalam, right? Which is just like the Sanusiya, the Silsila, the 5 or 6 books of Imam Sanusi, the Muqaddimah, the Hafida, the Sughra, al-Barahin, Wusta, Kubra, the Jawhara, Laqani, his own commentary, Bajuri's commentary, that whole type of Ashariism, right? You don't have that for the Maturidis. You don't. It just, you get the developers right there at the beginning. It sort of peaks with Abu Mu'in and Nasafi. Then, you got Ta'adil al-Ulum, Sadr al-Sharia as well. Ibn Humam obviously has the
Musayira.
Naam. So all of that is there. But Ibn Humam is not, rahimahullah, is not considered to be like your pure Maturidi. Even though they are on certain positions. He holds certain positions that are like Takween and others that are very Maturidi, but there's a lot of mazj that takes place. It's difficult to say this is pure Maturidism. So it seems to me that because the Farangi Mahallis they are coming in a lineage of huge powerhouses of Ilm al-Kalam, that it makes sense that the Sanad is Ashari. It makes sense that the Sanad, because there's no doubt that they would have studied Maturidism, like the Sharh al-Aqā'id, the Matan is Maturidi, right? Even the Sharh, it's not like Ashari Sharh, by the way. That's a misconception, because Taftazani is a Muhaqqiq.
Even the style of writing the book is very Maturidi.
Maturidi, but he's a Muhaqqiq. Like the definition of al-ilm, should it be defined, of course, and it is in Sharh al-Aqā'id at least defined. Yeah. He prefers the ta'rif, he gives tarjih to the ta'rif of Maturidi, of the Maturidis, not the Asharis, yes.
Oh. Yeah.
Right?
Allama Taftazani, you're saying?
Yes.
Inside the Sharh al-Aqā'id.
Inside the Sharh al-Aqā'id.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying
Although
to
there's certain places where he may also adopt the
Ashari position. Of course, like on Takween. He ala kullin, my point that I'm trying to make is the Farangi Mahallis for this main sanad to be Ashari makes sense, because they would have sought out the likes of Imam al-Ghazali and even like Ibn Humam, like all of their teachers were not Maturidis, Ashari teachers, and there's some level of tahqiq probably that needs to be done on that.
And then you have this mazj of Muhyiddin ibn Arabi's thought into the whole Farangi Mahali system. Some would argue that
he's the asal.
They become not just Maturidis but hybrid Maturidis. But that, I think we're going to leave that because
I'll just say one thing. Can I just say this?
Entire different podcast. Can
I just say this one thing? Yeah. The asal of the Farangi Mahal tradition is tasawwuf. The asal of it. The most amount of i'timad and trust of the ulama of the Farangi Mahal is on the Sufis, such as al-Shaykh al-Akbar ibn Arabi, Mullah Abdul Rahman Jami, al-Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. This is their bread and butter. In fact, I can show you where even when they are explaining what hamd is, what salat is, in the commentary like Muqaddimat, they will quote al-Shaykh al-Akbar says this, Jami says this, al-Shaykh al-Akbar says this, Jami says this. The go-to people for them are the Sufis, right? So I would say with a lot of with taking myself to account on this, that they at Asal were Sufis and the Kalam was secondary almost to their tasawwuf. They only spoke in that language because that is the manhaj of speaking. Otherwise, for them, they were Sufis.
Right, interesting.
Hence why they don't write Ashari Maturidi with their names. They write Qadri, Soharwardi, Chishti.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's why they write those things with their names.
So just in Kalam very quickly then, what kind of books maybe were being taught? I mean, there were Maturidi scholars. What kind of books in their curriculum were being taught?
But look, think about Sharh al-Jalaliya.
Wow.
Al-Ījī is a Shafi'i Ashari. Jalaluddin Dawani is a Shafi'i Ashari, right? Okay, Galambawi, the Muhshi, He's a late Hanafi, Ottoman Hanafi, isn't he? He's late, right? The Sharh al-Aqā'id al-Nasafiyya.
Yeah.
The Matin is a Maturidi. The Sharih is an Ash'ari. There's there's some khilaf, but he's a Muhaqqiq.
Yeah.
That's why it's hard to pinpoint what he is. So those were your two books of Kalam. After that, your Umur Amma, it's anyone's game. The Maturidis didn't write on Umur Amma. You don't have books of Umur Amma. Later, yes, you do. If you're going to include people like Asya al-Qurti, if you're going to include people like Abdul Ghaffur, if you're going to include those sorts of people and the Hawashi on the Umur Amma, yes. Right? So, but as independent works, no. But the Umur Amma was written by Ījī, commented upon most famously by his student, but also by Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani, most famously. And then that attracts all of the great Hawashi of Asya al-Qurti, Abdul Ghaffur and others.
So what we want to just establish here as well is that it's not that there's Ash'ari books inside this curriculum, which means they're teaching Ash'ari Kalam. They are obviously Maturidi still, so they're still teaching Maturidi.
But they
Kalam.
don't see a difference between the Maturidis and Ash'aris. They don't see that as different, except in certain masail. You must remember, for many people, although I don't fully agree personally, and I did teach the course on the Khilafiyat, and I made this point clear, but for many people, the difference between the Ash'aris and Maturidis is purely semantic.
I mean, you did have the period of Imam Aḍud-Dīn Al-Subki and others who tried to do this.
Yeah, well, they believed it was purely semantic. But I would argue that there are some theological differences.
And the point I'm making is that the Farangi Mahall is still Maturidi. So even though these kind of books are in there, they're obviously coming from a certain direction. So just a few points here. What's interesting is that what we've established so far is there is a continuation of intellectual thought in the Muslim world right up until now. You know, even there's pockets in the subcontinent where you're going to find this tradition very much alive in its truest form. And sometimes people misunderstand that because there's no books like the Mawaqif written anymore in the Muslim world for the last 400 years, 500 years, that means that there's been an intellectual decline. But what we actually find is, and there's people in academia talking about this right now, is that what you find for the last 500-600 years is a continuation of Muslim intellectualism, and that's happening by way of the Hawashi. So the Hawashi tradition that we find, and many of the commentaries on the Sulam al-Ulum in Mantiq by the Farangi Mahallis are mustaqil books within themselves, not necessarily on the science of Mantiq, but it goes into ilm al-Kalam and ma'az of Aqā'id and other things altogether. So what we find is that the intellectual tradition continues, and it continues in the form of the Hawashi, which are not Hawashi as we understand them as being, hadha fa'il, hadha maf'ul, and this is a badal of the mubdal minhu over here, except X, Y, and Z. But actually, these are mustaqil books that scholars decided that we're going to lead on the shoulders of these giants. Their books are maqbool and ma'ruf, and we're going to write our mustaqil book in alignment almost, or in attachment to those works that are already ma'ruf in the Muslim world. But what I want to just mention over here is another point that's quite interesting, is that engaging with classical kalam texts, it offers a unique benefit, and that is tashheezu zahn. And Imam Ahmad Rida Khan rahimahullah ta'ala in his Fatawa Ridawiyah, he actually alludes to that point as well. He mentions that bisaraha, that these books give you tashheezu zahn. It sharpens your mind greatly. Now this mental sharpening of the mind that's happening, it fosters a dynamic, sharp and creative scholar. He's now can go forward from here, and he's able to address challenges and defend the faith with remarkable agility. Now, do you think that our current disconnect from these traditional and intellectual sources might be contributing to a sense of, you could say, diminishing creativity in facing modern challenges that we're obviously all experiencing today?
There's no doubt. I think that's why if you look at even a lot of the modern dawah, the dawah guys that do a lot of dawah online and in person or what have you, and they have all of these programs on removing doubt, etc. They're all studying Kalam.
Right.
They're all studying Kalam. Why are they studying Kalam for? Because where else are you going to get the answers?
And it's
And
interesting.
I remember, there was a brother. He gave a really good discussion on testimony when somebody said to him, "How do you know that your prophet performed miracles?" And he said, "Because we have mass testimony." And he put basically the Aqā'id argument. And I found out. So this is a brother that hasn't studied in a Darul Uloom or tradition or anything like that. Unfortunately, some of them, if you told them about the mutakallimun, they'll be like, "Oh, the Ahl al-Bid'ah" or something. But then they're going to be using their examples, and they not all of them, but some of them. And then I found out that it was a brother that I know who is traditionally trained who gave him the argument. So what I'm trying to say is, a lot of these discussions that people are having now, the ones that are able to give some kind of answer, are drawing upon this tradition. Absolutely, they're drawing upon it. Look, if you think about if you think about someone like Ustadh Hassan, for example, great example, wrote a response to a position of Kant, etc. What was he drawing on?
Right.
Not just modern philosophy, he's drawing upon his own tradition.
It's interesting because we're talking about now, and the first half of the 16th century, the great scholar from the Ottoman tradition, the Tashqurzaada, he's lamenting at that time that there's a decline in, a drop in scholarly standards because people are leaving the Kalam tradition, which is interesting. So, Sharh al-Aqā'id Jalāliyah is a commentary by Allāma Jalāluddīn al-Dawani on al-Aqā'id al Aḍudīyyah by the great Allāma Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī. You have the book here in front of you. Alhamdulillah, which is one of the books taught in Kalam in the traditional Farangi Mahall curriculum and is taught today in parts of the subcontinent who are continuing the traditional Farangi Mahall curriculum. Now, Allāma Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī is a major scholar in Kalam, and he's obviously teacher of Allāma Taftazani. He's a teacher of Mir Sayyid al-Jurjani. He is one of the scholars in the Sanad of the Farangi Mahallis themselves. Can you just briefly introduce Allāma Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī? Who is he? And why is he him not being necessarily a household name in the Muslim Ummah? Does that necessitate that he, didn't make a huge contribution to the tradition like other scholars? Or who is
Al-Ījī rahimahullah ta'ala, al-Qadi al-Qudat, Qadi al-Mamlakat, Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī, al-Shafi'i al-Ash'ari, rahimahullah ta'ala, was Imam al-Azim, and a troubled life actually, politically speaking. He dies in jail.
Sahibi Kirman had him imprisoned towards the end of his life. He passed away whilst imprisoned. Yeah.
But he was also very close to many of the Salatin, particularly Abu al-Ishaq. And these are the Ilkhanid, the Mughals, basically. In fact, many of his works are dedicated to Abu Ishaq. So he has, in one way, he has a very flourishing political career as well. And you remember Abu Ishaq, the Sultan, actually gives him a mobile madrasa.
Wow.
So that wherever the Sultan travelled with his army, Ījī was with him to teach. So the Ottomans, they have a name called Diwan al-Hojasa, which is the fact that there's that Hoja, that Khaja, that teacher, who would come to the Diwan of the Sultan and he would lecture the Sultan. So Al-Ījī for Abu Ishaq was very similar. That was his direct person. You could say his religious minister, it was his religious vizier, etc., etc. So when you say Qadi al-Qudat, and his father was also Qadi al-Qudat, by the way. Right. And this is all happening in the Persian world, right? Al-Ījī, being Qadi al-Qudat, is basically like being Shaykh al-Islam in the Ottoman Empire. It's an official post. It's not that you give it to whomever you wish. It's an official post that's given to the one of the highest ranked scholars, and they have political as well as religious authority. So it's a post that's deeply rooted in the dawla, in the state itself. So Al-Ījī has a fine education, rahimahullah ta'ala. He is a Shafi'i. He produces a commentary famously on Ibn Hajib's work in Usul al-Fiqh, Shafi'i. He has a commentary on that, Al-Ījī. So he was a great Usuli scholar, a great Imam of Fiqh, etc. But he becomes very, very famous and he has other works, tafsir, he has different works. It's not like he's only got the one, but he becomes most famous for his al-Mawaqif. And the Mawaqif, as I alluded to earlier, is the one that's studied. But what's also interesting about the book is it is a sort of it's inspired by the Muhassal of Imam Razi. So although it's a book of theology, it begins with a discussion on ontology, a book on Umur Amma.
It's books like that for which Imam Subki in his Tabaqat al-Kubra will refer to Alama Dawani as being Imam al-Ma'kulat. Basically, it's books like this, and
Absolutely.
these kind of books go forward, and super commentaries are being written on them.
Well, for a Sayyid
by the
al-Sharif,
Farangi Mahallis themselves.
Aywa, for a Sayyid al-Sharif to write a commentary on your book is something.
Sayyid al-Sharif is not just writing commentary on his book, but he's also the student
Absolutely. Of al-Ījī.
Al-Ījī as well.
So, that's an interesting point. When thinking about al-Ījī, from his Talamiza is the likes of a Sayyid al-Sharif, al-Jurjani, right? So, al-Ījī is important in from the perspective of the fact that he produced students and from the perspective that he produced great works. So, a Sayyid al-Sharif writes a commentary on the Mawaqif. Now, this Mawaqif, like I said, it was that movement into introducing more philosophy into the works of theology. The Muhassal is there, but the Mawaqif is significantly larger. Now, what al-Ījī does, and that makes him very unique, is even though he's writing al-Mawaqif, which is basically a matan, a very, very dense and expansive matan, but nevertheless it's a matan, right? He gives his own tahqiqat in that matan. Like, he has a way of writing. He really does. Even in the Aqā'id.
Right.
The Aqā'id is a small matan. Like, I translated some of my thingy, right?
Aqā'id Nasafi.
Al-Aqā'id al Aḍudīyyah.
Right.
And so it's a great thing to do, to sit there and juxtapose the matan of al-Ījī and the matan of al-Nasafi.
You've translated it.
Yeah. The Aqā'id of
Aqā'id
al-Ījī.
al
Al-Aḍudīyyah. So sit there now with the Nasafi and sit there now with the Aqā'id of al-Ījī and compare, because one is Maturidi and one is Ash'ari. But the Mawaqif is celebrated because of they are his tahqiqat. And in fact, many said that Sayyid al-Sharif and al-Taftazani, much of their work was actually about preserving the positions of al-Ījī.
Right.
That's really interesting.
Very interesting.
Like,
point.
so he's like a game changer.
Right.
Yeah, basically.
What else is interesting is that going forward from here, the Muhaqqiq, essentially, Allama Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī, and it's interesting because Allama Taftazani, you mentioned him here, he actually refers to Allama Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī as being Muhaqqiq.
Al-Muhaqqiq.
And that's very commonplace now to call somebody Muhaqqiq, but when Taftazani is calling you a Muhaqqiq,
when a Muhaqqiq calls you a Muhaqqiq,
that has a different vibe.
A different
altogether.
vibe.
And it's interesting because in one place I was reading Allama Taftazani rahimahullah, he says, for the Nazir, he can't do anything but benefit from the tahqiqat of Allama Aḍud-Dīn Al-Ījī. And he says these words, he says, وَحَاشَاهُ أَن يَنْقُسَ أَوْ يَزِيدُ.
Allah.
So it's very interesting that this is Allama Taftazani's tribute to his teacher, but also not just being biased that he's my teacher, but he was
Full
the
stop.
Muhaqqiq of the age.
He was a full stop.
He was a
full stop scholar.
Now, this Sharh al-Aqā'id al Aḍudīyyah or Jalāliyah, which is taught in the traditional Dars-i-Nizami tradition, in the Farangi Mahall tradition, even just when you look at the commentaries on his matan, the ulama mentioned that the Sharh al-Aqā'id Jalāliyah, in comparison to the Sharh al-Aqā'id Nasafiyah, is the comparison of teaching. The Sharh al-Aqā'id Nasafiyah is like you're studying Khulasat Kaydani in fiqh, and the Sharh al-Aqā'id Jalāliyah is like you're going into the higher books of fiqh, like
the
Hidayah and so on.
So
there's a huge difference. But what's interesting in that is that the commentary being so difficult is also an ishara that the matan is very daqiq as well.
The
and
matan is daqiq.
Very deep as well.
The matan is daqiq. I was trying to look for, but because in this print, you didn't separate. I explained this. Now, I gave an example of this. So I think I might be, by Allah's fadl and karam, I might be the first person that ever taught this matan in the English language. And I remember explaining this. I was just looking for this now. And if I could just share this one thing with you to give you an example of that, of the diqqa of the ibara of al-Aqā'id. You know when you're going to look at it, you're going to think, well, it's just like a couple of pages, right? It is a couple of pages. But it's a bit like the waraqat, is that he is so, like, okay, this is not the main example that I wanted to give you. But like, for example, in the Ash'ari tradition, you affirm Allah's attributes, the ma'ani, yeah? Again, this is targeted at Tullab al-Ilm, right?
Of course, the whole podcast.
The whole podcast is for Tullab al-Ilm. So I don't have to explain terms, I can just move on, right?
That's right.
So the ma'ani sifat are ma'na za'id ala zat, right? That's the general understanding of them, yeah? I'm not talking about the later tradition where they become Ainu Dhat, or Ainu Dhat in the Farangi Mahall tradition. I'm not talking about that, because that's a whole different discussion on the sifat, right? But at least in this period of Ash'ari Kalam, the sifat are ma'ani za'ida ala dhat. Now, so when Allah Ta'ala creates, it's not that Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala and His Qudra, the Qudra is Allah, and the relationship between Allah and the Maqdur is an i'tibar. Yeah? Which is the position of the Mu'tazila and the position of many of the later Sufiya, basically, right? But Allah يعني يقدر بقدرته. You see, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His qudra extends to the maqdur by way of the sifa of qudra. That's one mas'ala, yeah? And I took a little bit of time to explain that there. That Allah ta'ala, He creates through the sifa of qudra, yeah? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala qadir bi qudratihi. Allah ta'ala murid bi iradatihi. Allah alim bi ilmihi. Allah sami' bi sam'ihi. Allah basir bi basarihi. Allah mutakallim bi kalamihi. Allah hayy bi hayatihi. That's what we say, right? Also, when you talk about huduth, contingency, when we're talking about what does it mean for al-alam to be hadith, what do we say? We say two things, don't we? We say, what does it mean for al-alam to be hadith? Number one, it is muhtaj ila al-ghayr, ila al-wajib, يعني. It's muhtaj ila al-ghayr. It depends on something. That definition is musallim between us and the philosophers. Like Ibn Sina. For Ibn Sina, huduth is what? It is ma yahtaju ila Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because he would say that the makhluk sadara an Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, an zatihi sharifa, right? There was sudur, emanation. So what's the problem with that? He affirms qidam al-alam, that the universe is pre-eternal, that the universe was not creation ex nihilo. So Imam al-Ghazali, the Mutakallimun, they say, no, for us, the huduth is of two things. It's ihtiyaj ila al-ghayr, na'am, but it's also al-wujud ba'd al-adam, or al-wujud min al-adam, yeah? Wujud ba'd al-adam. That's a whole discussion that existence is ex nihilo, meaning from nothing, Allah Ta'ala created. So there isn't this pre-eternality to the universe in any form. Now those are two huge discussions. Like, can you imagine, I mean, I'm just dropping this like this, but can you imagine I was explaining this now to a class of students?
Right.
How much time?
Two lessons.
At least, yes. I'll be explaining that with some level of detail. What do you mean ex nihilo? How do we establish it?
Right.
We establish it with perhaps Jawhar Arad, whatever it may be, right? His line, where those two masail are indicated to, look how he says it. Kana bi qudratillahi ta'ala, the universe you talk about. Right. The universe. Kana bi qudratillahi ta'ala ba'da an lam yakun. Subhanallah. Moves on.
Subhanallah.
Now look, when you read that now, you're like, Kana, but how? Bi qudratillahi ta'ala ba'da an lam yakun. That's huduth. One line. He is so daqiq in his ibara that there's nothing. He could have just said that al-alam kana, right? But he had to mention bi qudratillahi ta'ala. Right? Don't forget, by Allah.
So he's doing ishara to so many masail.
And that's why if you look at that line, so the one he has a lengthy bit on it, and then look at the hashiya of Galambawi, it's going to go on for a good while.
Right.
Because he's mentioned in that line something so daqiq. And there was one other one that I really wanted to mention, because I remember pulling up in class and I explained that, look, can you see Can you explain? Give me just, if you don't mind, give me 1 second. I should have.
While you're looking for that, just a quick question would be that, the matan of Aqā'id al
Al-Aqā'id.
Aḍudīyyah.
No.
How's the book structured? Is it in a way similar to the structure of the Ash'ari books?
Yes.
You find that in
Yes.
there?
But just extremely
Daqiq.
daqiq. Like it is it is structured, but it's not like the Sunusiyya. I'll give you an example. The Sunusiyya is like written for the non-mutakallim that wants kalam.
Right. And this is written for
Like it's just simplified. But this is written for someone who wanted to summarize the lub of kalam for you.
Interesting.
Like, I don't believe when he wrote the Aqā'id, Wallahu alam, I could be terribly wrong on this. I don't believe he wrote it so that this is what you teach the children.
Right.
I don't believe that. I believe that he wrote this to select the most choicest positions of kalam. If I can't find it,
If you can't find it, then we have some good news anyway. That inshallah Azza wa Jalla at the Khairabadi Institute, Maulana Shams Tameez, who is specializing in Kalam, inshallah Azza wa Jal, will be teaching the Aqā'id al Aḍudīyyah with us, inshallah Azza wa Jal. And we look forward to that. We look forward to having this book being introduced to the talabatul ilm in the coming future, inshallah. I just want to ask you as well.
I'm gonna have to leave it. The reason being is because
we'll leave it for this podcast, inshallah, but we look forward to bringing those examples, inshallah, forth in the course, inshallah, when this will be taught in the coming near future, inshallah. And the details of that you'll find online, inshallah. I just want to ask this final question and we'll close up, inshallah. As I've mentioned, you, inshallah, you will be teaching this here at the Khairabadi Institute. What do you hope students will gain after reading and discussing this book? Meaning, by studying this book, what new knowledge or skills will the students have acquired that they may not have achieved from texts, basic texts in Kalam like the Sunusiyya that are taught quite, regularly and throughout the UK and around the world? What's unique about this particular book? Why is Khairabadi Institute introducing this text, and why are you coming here and teaching it, basically?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I think it gives somebody an idea into firstly the style of al-Ījī and his Kalamic ways of writing. That's one, and that's important because al-Ījī is so important. Secondly, the birth of the Muhaqqiqeen generation of the likes of Taftazani, Sayyid Sharif and Jurjani. Well, this is the Shaykh of that entire tabaqa. So I think it's really going to the source and taking it from them. That's one. Secondly, it's a absolutely fantastic, yet so small, of a summary of the most fundamental kalam discussions in our entire tradition. Like I said, with a single harf jara, he will do that. And I gave you that example talking a little while ago.
It was the bihi, right?
Yeah, there's he just with a single harf jara, he will indicate towards a position that it's mind-boggling how he can do that. So I think when people look at it, they just sort of look at it and think, oh, it's just a couple of pages. Okay, come, let's sit down and let's discuss these couple of pages. And you'll appreciate the density of the book. That's one. Of the text, of the risala, whatever you want to call it, right? That's two. Secondly is because when we read it, naturally we're going to always look at the commentary on a book when we're going to teach it or we're going to study it. Naturally, we're going to do that. So you get to now be in conversation with Dawani. And that's also an important reason for why this Aqā'id is so important. When we teach the Matan of Nasafi, you're in conversation with Taftazani. When we teach Taftazani, you're in conversation with Khayali. That's exactly how it is, right? Right. Likewise, when you are reading the Aqā'id of al-Nasafi, of al-Ījī, it's not just the beauty and the sort of this talkhis of masail that al-Ījī has given to you and this beautiful banquet that he's put forward for you, but the opening of all of those masail that you're going to be doing it with Dawani, because he's going to be the base of the text. So even though, let's say, if I'm teaching it, I'm going to bring other sources, I'm going to bring other ideas, things that I know or I'm looking at other places. But the base that I'm going to base the arguments on is going to be Dawani. So essentially what you end up doing is reading Dawani with the Aqā'id.
Right.
Not in its entirety, because this is a very, very dense book, Dawani, but you get to taste that, you get to be in conversation with that period of Kalam. that period. See, when you're doing the Nasafi, you're in discussion with the early period of Maturidi Kalam.
Right.
When you're here, you're in this period of Ashari Kalam, and it's a great,
which is opening the third wave of Kalam.
of Kalam. Yes,
Interesting.
so it's very
So
interesting.
like 5x.
Yes, it's very, it's wonderful. And also, can I say, as a last, and I'll end on this, that sometimes people, they do i'tiraz on this, they object to this. There is a barakah in the books of these great Imams.
No doubt.
Right? There's a reason why they survived. Right? Like Imam Malik said with the Muwatta, everyone's writing the Muwattas. Well, whoever wrote it for Allah will remain. Quduri, look, we've got books on Tasheeh of Quduri. It's not bizatihi, the best book in fiqh ever written, but Allah gave it sharafi qabuliyat. Allah gave it an honor. It's true or not? There could be another book that you could say, in terms of from certain perspectives, is better than Quduri, right? But Quduri itself became maqbool. Why? I gave you the example of the Ibn Qasim al-Ghazi on the Matan Abi Shuja'a. I was like, when the author of a book leaves his post as a qadi and goes and becomes a cleaner in the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ, and then ends up taking the post of cleaning inside the Rawda Sharifa of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, that heart, that soul that wrote this book in Fiqh Shafi'i, and now you question why it's so maqbool and ma'roof and everyone has studied the book. Right? So likewise, these sort of people like al-Ījī, Allah Ta'ala has given them a certain qabuliyat, And so I think when we're studying this book, I can give you badahir, these reasons for why it's such an important book, because it is a talkhis of ilm al-kalam, talkhis of it, the lub of the masail of kalam, and he'll give that to you with particles, not even nouns and verbs, right? But also there's a qabuliyat that comes with these books.
We thank you, Mawlana Shams, for coming down today, or me coming down to see you rather, and the mashaqqa you endured in getting this done.
Allah yabarak fik.
And we look forward to having you at the Khairabadi Institute teaching this, inshallah, online.
Inshallah,
and the details of this will be found on all the social media, and at the bottom of this video you can also find links of how to access those classes, inshallah, that will be coming up in the very near future, inshallah. Sometime this year, inshallah. Jazakallahu khairan.
Barakallahu fikum.
Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next podcast.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
الحمد للمتوحد بجلاله المتفرد